Insurance isn't one size fits all, and shopping for it shouldn't feel like squeezing into something that just doesn't fit. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they show you options that fit your budget. Enough hunting for discounts, trying to calculate rates, and tinkering with coverages. Maybe you're picking out your very first policy, or maybe you're just looking for something that works better for you and your family. Either way, they make it simple to see your options. No guesswork, no surprises. Ready to see how easy and fun shopping for car insurance can be? Visit progressive.com and give the Name Your Price tool a try. Take the stress out of shopping and find coverage that fits your life on your terms. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster. I'm a historian and an author, and I've been curious about the Tudors since I was a little girl. This season on the podcast, we will be talking about the notorious Tudors, who they were, the times they lived in, and what was happening elsewhere in the world at the same time. So in terms of this podcast and this season, the Tudor era I'm defining as starting in 1421, which is the year of the birth of Henry Tudor, aka Henry VII, and ending in 1603, which is the death of Elizabeth I, who was the final Tudor monarch. So anyone who was alive at all between those 2 years is fair game for this season of the podcast. And this is a massive amount of time. It's almost 200 years. And so 1421, like we're talking about like back England, the Wars of the Roses, the Yorks and the Plantagenets and the Lancaster, like this whole mess. We talked about it last week on the podcast, and all these cousins who are fighting each other. And then the end of the Tudor era, Elizabeth I dies. Like this is like Shakespeare, we're in the Renaissance. Like this whole saga goes from what a lot of people would consider like the medieval period into the Renaissance period. And this episode covers both because we're talking about Margaret of Anjou, who was Queen of England during the Wars of the Roses era, kind of on and off because her husband Henry VI kept being kicked off the throne and then he's put back on the throne, and she's such a powerful woman. And then almost like 200 years later, William Shakespeare writes a bunch of plays, and she's in those plays, Margaret of Anjou. And she has the most screen time, or I guess stage time, of any female character in any Shakespearean play, because she appears in several of his different plays because she was around for so much this time period. But I think this is such a good episode to have for this podcast for this season because we're talking about a character, a real life person who was alive during the beginning of the Tudor era, and then how somebody, William Shakespeare, towards the end of the Tudor era, wrote a play about her. So it's like both ends all at the same time. And what we're talking about today, it's an interview with two authors, is Charles O'Malley and Scott W. Stern, who are authors of the new book, Shakespeare's Margaret, The Dramatic Life of a Warrior Queen, which is looking at the life of Margaret of Anjou as she's portrayed in Shakespeare's plays. It's a really good book. I really recommend it. It's such an interesting concept for a book. In our discussion you're about to hear, we talk about the real Margaret of Anjou, but then also what theater was like when Shakespeare was writing his plays, and why Shakespeare's Margaret is maybe one of Shakespeare's best characters, certainly his most interesting female character. So please enjoy this chat with Charles O'Malley and Scott W. Stern, authors of Shakespeare's Margaret, The Dramatic Life of a Warrior Queen. Okay, so today I'm joined by Charles O'Malley and Scott W. Stern, authors of the new book, Shakespeare's Margaret, The Dramatic Life of a Warrior Queen, which is I've never read a book like this before. It's like a biography of a fictional character, but also the biography of the real life person, and also talking about what it was like to do plays in a Shakespeare time. It's a lot altogether, and I'm really excited to talk to you. So welcome. If Charles and Scott, if you can each just introduce yourself and explain kind of what your background is with this topic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. We're totally thrilled to be here talking about Margaret and her portrayals. So my name is Charlie O'Malley. I am a dramaturg. So I'm kind of the theater person on this project. And so what a dramaturg is, it's kind of, for those of you who don't know, it's kind of like an editor who works with plays, new plays, old plays. So I have a lot of history with, reading Shakespeare's work and putting it on stage in a whole bunch of different contexts. And I'm also a historian and a writer. I love looking at theater history and figuring out how these stories are relevant, and working with new plays too, and figuring out, how we can how we can really bring, new voices to the stage. And so I've been intrigued by the character of Margaret. She shows up in four of Shakespeare's earliest plays, his history plays, where he's writing the recent history of England, kind of memorializing like what the English character is. So I think Margaret's just a fascinating person, and I've been in love with her for decades. And Scott, my co-conspirator, also spouse, he's a writer, and he kind of had the idea that we could work on this project together. So I'll pass it over to Scott.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us on this podcast. Yeah, I'm Scott Stern. I am a writer and a critic and a historian, and I come to this less from a theater background, in fact, no theater background, and instead from a history and nonfiction background. I've previously written two books of narrative nonfiction, both about the history of gender and violence. And so Margaret's story is of a much earlier time period than what I'm really used to, but there are a lot of themes of sort of structural misogyny and violence and also resistance that really carried through. And so to me, this was a very exciting new project where not only did I get to collaborate for the first time on a book, but also write about an earlier era. And as you say, write a somewhat unusual narrative in that we call this a biography, but it's not a biography of the historical person. It's a biography of the character and the way the character has changed over several centuries.
And what I thought we could focus on for this conversation, because the book is so interesting and there's so many levels to it, but just so we can sort of explain, introduce it to people who might not have a lot of background in understanding about Shakespeare and theater or understanding about this part of English history. One of the things that I think a lot of people probably know from movies like Shakespeare in Love is that these plays during Shakespeare's life, the women's roles were played by young men.
Yeah.
So can you talk about and this was, the first Margaret, so she appears in 4 Shakespeare's plays, and I thought we could kind of go in order, her appearance in each of those plays and what it's like. How much were audiences at that point used to watching a young man play a woman's role? How long had that been happening for?
It had been several decades that on English stages, certainly in the capital, it had been exclusively boys in dresses playing women. Earlier centuries, there had been women appearing on stage, and actually on the European continent, there were still women appearing on stage at that time. But for a variety of reasons, England started only having young men in drag playing female characters. And so that was totally normal for audiences at the time. Now, that doesn't mean it was uncontroversial. There were a lot of religious figures who really, really hated this and viewed it as evidence of theater's depravity. But audiences would have known to expect it. And there's some interesting evidence and some sort of scholarly speculation that this may even have provided a kind of thrill or titillation for audiences, that they kind of, got off on seeing gender play on stage. And playwrights like Shakespeare really played with those expectations. So there's a lot of characters in Shakespeare who are women who then dress as men. So what you're really seeing is a boy dressing as a woman, dressing as a man. And that kind of gender play was something that it appears audiences really responded to.
So this is the 1590s. So this is, as you were mentioning, Shakespeare in Love, or if people know the movie or the book Hamlet, this is around the same time, early in Shakespeare's career, late in Queen Elizabeth I's life. She's the last monarch of the Tudor dynasty, and Shakespeare is writing these plays about how the Tudor dynasty came to be. So he's, if you might remember from Old English class or something, Shakespeare wrote comedies, he wrote tragedies, and he wrote these plays that we also call the histories. So they're kind of chronicles of English history. And they all kind of have to flatter Elizabeth and her family because there was a lot of censorship going on at the time. She loved theater, but she also had a really strong hand in what was being performed on public stages. So these plays had to kind of, show her family, people that ended up being her family, in a good light. And as Scott was mentioning, you do have these plays, for example, if you remember As You Like It or Twelfth Night, those are plays in which, the boy plays a girl who goes for most of the play in costume as a male as well. But when he gets to Margaret, he comes up with this person. He comes across this person in history who is a real person. She was a foreigner, a French princess who, as a teenager, she was forced, by diplomatic relation to marry the King of England to kind of hopefully provide some sort of peace between England and France, who had been at war. But she also ruled the way a continental woman would, which is not a way an English woman would. There were no queens regnant in England at the time. We didn't have a process of women ruling in their husband's place. But when Margaret comes along, she kind of thought she could do that. And so Shakespeare's really playing with that. He comes up with this idea of this woman who dominates these plays. And she is not just going to sit back and say, yes, my lord. She is going to come forward and tell her husband what she thinks. And he creates all of these, kind of incredible scenarios that she finds herself in these plays. He's kind of experimenting with, how do we address women in power? Just like, as we're coming to the end of Elizabeth's life, we know she doesn't have an heir, en route. And how are we kind of working that out on our public stages on London stages?
I think it's an interesting sort of balancing act that Shakespeare needs to do with this character. The audience are people who are used to having a woman in charge because Elizabeth's been on the throne for decades, and they're used to that, and they know she's good at it, and she's a pretty popular monarch. But at the same point, the character of Margaret is a foreigner, and she is on ultimately the losing side of this war. So showing here's a powerful woman, but also but she's also kind of a villain because, she's French, and those are still kind of our enemies. So just, could you speak about I guess how audiences would have viewed this character? If we're looking at her first appearance, which is in what we now call Henry VI, Part 2. We'll explain that later. It's like Star Wars Chapter 4. So it starts with Henry VI, Part 2. How do you think he wrote her for an audience? How do you think they would have accepted this character?
So when she's first introduced in this play, which, as you mentioned, is kind of picking up in the middle of the timeline, he later goes back and does the, kind of prequel plays. She is introduced kind of structurally as an antagonist. She is married to the king. You don't necessarily know that she's been married to him against her will. And Shakespeare sets her up as one of the power players in the court. He creates an extramarital affair for her, which we have no evidence that Margaret ever had that she ever cheated on her husband, the King of England.
When she was 14, yeah.
When she was 14, which would have been a wild thing to do with a man who actually was in his 50s at the time. But Shakespeare creates a love story for them. And though she's very harsh and she's very cruel, in the subsequent play, we see her kill people on stage. We also see a lot of vulnerability for her. We see her, in this play, in Henry VI, Part 2, she has this lover. Her lover is then killed, and she comes on stage holding his severed head. She speaks to it. And the king is talking to her and saying, "What are you doing?" And she can't see anything. So just imagine what this was like for audiences in the 1590s, seeing a 13-year-old boy in a wig, carrying a prop head with fake blood on it, talking to it. And this is the Queen of England. This is radical at the time. We'd never seen royals behave like this. And this is something that Shakespeare is kind of playing with, and this is before he's written people like Cleopatra or Juliet, or some of the other really famous women in his plays that, later, all these, we've had, so many marvelous performances of. But Margaret has rough edges, but she can really vacillate between someone that you just really hate and also someone that you pity, because she does have a real human side to her, and she has a lot of wrong. She's wronged in a lot of ways in this place.
I think that's a great point, Charlie. And I think the other thing is that kind of ambivalence about Margaret as both villain and a really sympathetic figure is something that I think that's probably the sentiment audiences would have had at the time. And it reflected real anxieties they had about Queen Elizabeth I, who was aging. And there was real anxiety about the lack of an heir. And so, there was a true cult of personality surrounding her in England in the early 1590s. And so there were people who were, very devoted to her. And at the same time, there were popular uprisings against her, and people were really stressed out about what was going to happen next. And so you kind of see that anxiety among some other anxieties we can talk about being metabolized on stage in this character of Margaret, who was, a name people might have recognized from the past, but probably not one they knew much about. So she's kind of this blank slate that Shakespeare is projecting all of these anxieties onto.
Well, and also you were mentioning like with the, coming on stage with the head and everything. Like I do think it would be good to explain to the listeners that at the time, going to see a play, like now it's like, oh, I'm going to go see Shakespeare at the festival and the ticket is $200 and it's like Sir Patrick Stewart and it's all very like classy. But then it's like you're either going to go see a play or you're going to go see like someone like fighting a bear. Like these are, and they both cost very little. Or like could, if you're, depending where you're sitting. So could you explain like Shakespeare at this time, he's like trying to draw in crowds by just having things that people are going to be like excited about.
Yeah, Shakespeare is like mass entertainment. This is a time, obviously, before television, but also before like widespread literacy. So most people couldn't read. So like telling stories was a principal form of entertainment. And yeah, as you say, the other forms of entertainment that people would pay or sometimes not pay to see were like bear baiting or bull baiting, clowning, miming, also public executions. So this was like a populace that was used to pretty extreme forms of entertainment. And so Shakespeare really had to lean into that. So now these plays are seen as like, classics and elevated pieces of culture and something that's not often thought of as like mass appeal. But at the time, these were extreme. There were battles on stage. There's love affairs. There's people coming back from the dead and talking as ghosts. And so this was a form of entertainment for the masses. And Shakespeare, and basically all of the other popular playwrights from the 1580s and 90s and early 1600s meant it to be for the masses and easily comprehensible. And so that shaped the way that these characters were portrayed. They were not meant to be on a pedestal and at a distance. They were physically very close by, and they were meant to be figures that audience members could identify with or hate righteously or love.
I'm just wondering how much you know, Charlie, about how gruesome those special effects would have been in a show like this. Like when you bring out the head, like how gross would it have looked?
It would have been probably pretty extreme. There's a lot of evidence in the text of Shakespeare's plays, and not to get to, this is what scholars think, but there's a lot of evidence if you just look at the lines where you can tell there's meant to be some interplay with the audiences or just kind of some joking around with them too. We have this idea that you sit quietly and hold your hands and the lights go down, but these were shows done outdoors. People were kind of coming and going. People were selling goods. There was, sex work happening. One of the later plays in the early 1600s, they would use cannons. That's actually why the First Globe Theater burnt down, because of a spark from a cannon during a performance. So yeah, as Scott said, they're trying to keep up with like the bear baitings next door. They know that people want something really visceral. And in a way, we still see this a lot with the way people engage with, like dating shows or something. They want to feel like they're seeing something real, like reality television. Elizabeth herself actually really enjoyed performance. She sponsored some troops, and that's something that a lot of people in her court didn't like. They thought it was low, and they thought it was popular, but she liked it. And she had, certain actors that she liked. And, I think if you remember, there are some scenes in Shakespeare in Love in which they go and they perform at the court. That's very different than when they're performing for the groups of people who would pay just a penny to stand, and they'd stand all afternoon. And sometimes they get rained on as they're watching, these, crazy battle scenes. These history plays have huge casts with so many characters and battle scene after battle scene after battle scene. Today, we look at them and we're like, okay, maybe you should condense a little bit. But at the time, that's really what the audiences love to watch.
Well, and the plays would have been, 2 or 3 hours long? Like you need to keep people entertained in a sustained way for quite a period of time.
Oh, yeah. And that's also why there would have been probably these, he would have read a whole series of history plays. As you mentioned, Henry VI has 3 different parts. He was responding to popular tastes. These one, he wrote part 2, or what we now call part 2. He wrote a sequel play, and then later he wrote an earlier play, kind of like trying to add on to the, as you mentioned, like Star Wars or something, or like, like kind of fan service, like there was another Legally Blonde, there was another Devil Wears Prada, People wanted to see these characters again. And sometimes in the beginning of the plays, they do the same thing that they do in like The Devil Wears Prada 2, where they'll call back. They'll be like, remember this character? Here's me, reminding you what she did in the previous play.
Well, and that's where I'm curious to know. So, like, the play comes out chronologically, the first one, what we now call Henry VI Part 2. Margaret is like a fairly major character in this play, and then clearly people respond to her because in the next one, does she have an even bigger part or similar size part?
Oh yeah, in the play we now call Part 3, which is kind of the end of this trilogy. That's kind of the climax of the Wars of the Roses, which are this dynastic battle that Margaret's court is involved in. And that's the one where we see her really take over for her husband, and she leads armies. She has this tremendous speech to her troops that is very reminiscent of a speech that Elizabeth gave to troops. So they're really, really kind of the Shakespeare and when he was working with on these plays, because they certainly were collaborative endeavors. It wasn't just one person, one genius sitting alone at a computer, right? This is a whole group of people participating. They want to really play up that similarity to Elizabeth.
And I mean, this is also like, she's not just sort of akin to a protagonist of Henry VI Part 3, but she's also like continually heightening the stakes and doing things that would have shocked the audience. So that, like, the play basically opens with her calling her husband, who is the King of England, like weak and incapable, and then she like says, "I divorce thee," and like leaves him and goes off to raise an army herself. So she is like, from the get-go of Henry VI Part 3, she is set out as the far more militant royal in charge, and the one who is like going to be leading the army, and the one who pretty early in the play stabs her principal rival at the time, the Duke of York. And so she is like, she's set up as the head of one of the two warring factions in this, like, basically a civil war that is racking England. And so audiences would have understood her as like basically a general akin to any of the other male generals on the stage, in something that's completely wrong historically, is like leading armies in battle, like in the front of the army on stage.
I'm just wondering, you talk in the book, and I kind of know this from Shakespeare in Love, like my main like understanding of plays in this time. People are, like, there's, they're buying food and stuff, and if they don't like the play, like they're throwing tomatoes or whatever at the actress. Do you think that she was a character that people were like, hell yeah, or people are just like, oh my god, this woman, she's overstepping, like this is horrifying, and they would throw stuff at her? Like, what do you think? How do you think they would have understood a woman leading troops into battle in this play?
So that's a really good question. And I think that part of it has to do with Elizabeth I, who didn't personally like, she was not at the like head of the army, but there's a very famous moment in her rule where she puts on like male battle armor and gives a pretty famous speech where she talks about having the heart and the stomach of a king. And so I think audience members would have understood that this was an obvious allusion to Elizabeth I, and so they might have been a little reluctant to be like too vocally opposed. But I also think that like there is some evidence from Shakespeare's time that suggests that Margaret was very popular. So she probably was not the person who was getting like booed or having like tomatoes thrown on her face. Like, it appears that some of the lines about her were like among the more popular ones. And probably the strongest evidence that she was popular is that Shakespeare kept bringing her back. He keeps inserting her into scenes that in history she wouldn't have actually been in. And then he he writes the sequel, Henry VI Part 3. And then later he'll write the prequel, Henry VI Part 1. And then after that, he'll write Richard III. And he easily could have cut her from any of those plays. The sort of historical documents that he was basing these plays loosely on did not pay much attention to Margaret. But the fact that he keeps bringing her back, it's an indication of the fact that Shakespeare was really into her, but also probably that audiences really responded to this character, quite possibly more than the other characters in the play.
She's also memorable. When you're watching these plays, there are a lot of dukes, It's the same when you're watching, Star Wars or World War II thing, and you have all these generals, and you're like, who are these people? But she knows that if there's the one woman in the play, you're going to remember her. And when she's off stage, you notice that she's gone too. At the beginning of Part 3, she ties up her enemy, kills his son in front of her, wipes her handkerchief in his son's blood, and wipes that all over his face. That's a tremendous thing for a person to do. And even today, people have trouble playing that scene because it's so difficult. At the end of that play, Margaret's son is killed in front of her. Spoiler alert for history that's many centuries old. And then she weeps over his body and she says, "Please kill me too. I need you to kill me too." And they won't do it. The enemy soldiers won't do it. And that's just such a tremendous shift for one character to do over the course of a 2 or 3 hour play. And Shakespeare is trusting a 14-year-old boy or
That's what I was thinking.
person, like an apprentice player, because they would have apprentices that would often play the female roles, and the more studied, more practiced actors would play, Richard III, the big male roles. But he has some sort of young actor who he thinks can play this. That must show us something about what was going on at the time. There must have been actors that he trusted or talent that he saw that he could write these characters for.
Well, and you're saying characters, and because Shakespeare, you say in your book that he includes more interesting women characters than most of his contemporaries would. Can you speak about the difference in how he writes women versus how other people might have?
Absolutely. So just to skip ahead a little bit to part one, which we've mentioned is kind of that prequel that he wrote a little bit later. One of the central characters of that is a character called Joan Pucelle, who we all know as Joan of Arc, who I'm sure is, very familiar to most listeners. And she just, she was French like Margaret. She was fighting against the English, but on behalf of the French. And she was kind of a central character in that play. And then she disappears very quickly. As we know, she's executed. End of that play, Margaret comes on. So he's kind of replacing one militant woman who is really, exploding expectations for the way that women should behave in these stories with another one. And that's how he chooses to introduce Margaret, when she's young, when she's a young girl in that story. But there really weren't other characters that were kind of appearing like this at the time.
And I would just add that, you are seeing in works like Shakespeare's contemporaries, so people that you might have heard of like Christopher Marlowe or Ben Jonson, you're seeing the emergence of what we would now call kind of an anti-hero, which is like a flawed protagonist. Someone like Richard III, who's like really intriguing to watch and you're like maybe even rooting for him a bit, but you also know he's like a bad person. Shakespeare's real innovation was that in Margaret and in some of the other characters in these plays, he's creating characters like that are women. And so this is Margaret, and it's, Joan, and it's Eleanor Cobham, who is a rival of Margaret's in Henry VI, Part 2. And these are female characters who are just as complex and just as violent and dangerous as their male counterparts. And so that was unusual and something that audiences might have recognized at the time as something of an innovation and something that would have kept them coming back. And is, probably part of why Shakespeare has persisted. Like, there are the famous male characters like Hamlet or Macbeth, but there's also like Lady Macbeth, and there's also Margaret. And so we have these totally singular characters. And I think that was an innovation from the time.
And now for a quick advertising break.
Starting or growing your own business can be intimidating and lonely at times. Your to-do list may feel endless with new tasks, and lists can easily begin to overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything as a built-in business partner can be a game changer. For millions of businesses, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Gymshark, Rare Beauty, and Heinz, to brands just getting started. Shopify has hundreds of ready-to-use templates that can help you build a beautiful online store that matches your brand's style. And you can tackle all the important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. And if people haven't heard about your brand, you can get the word out like you have a marketing team behind you, with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns to reach customers wherever they're scrolling or strolling. Start your business today with the industry's best business partner, Shopify, and start hearing. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. That's shopify.com/realm.
Welcome to the realms of peril and glory. Explore the mechanically magical vistas of Vale, the paranormal mysteries of liminal London and the cyberpunk chaos of Cyborg. Be awed by our incredible guests from familiar shows like Oxventure and No Rolls Barred. Search Realms of Peril and Glory to find out more.
The war is over, and both sides lost. Kingdoms were reduced to cinders, and armies scattered like bones in the dust. Now the survivors claw to what's left of a broken world, praying the darkness chooses someone else tonight. But in the Shadow Dark, the darkness always wins. This is old school adventuring at its most cruel. Your torch ticks down in real time, and when that flame dies, something else rises to finish the job. This is a brutal rules-light nightmare with a story that emerges organically based on the decisions that the characters make. This is what it felt like to play RPGs in the 80s, and man, it is so good to be back. Join the Glass Cannon podcast as we plunge into the Shadow Dark every Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern on youtube.com/theglasscannon, with the podcast version dropping the next day. See what everybody's talking about and join us in the dark.
Hi, listeners. We want to tell you about a podcast we love. It's called Rebel Girls, formerly known as Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls. It's about real-life women who are changing the world with their courage, creativity, and big, bold ideas. Want to know how Taylor Swift became a superstar? Or hear how Simone Biles became the greatest athlete of all time? From immersive stories to heartfelt interviews to super smart advice, Rebel Girls brings you stories that will get you fired up to become your best self. There are over 400 episodes for you to explore, with new episodes every week. So check it out. Listen to Rebel Girls wherever you get your podcasts. And find us on youtube.com/rebelgirls. And whatever you do, stay rebel.
And we're back. Well, and I'm wondering, I saved this quote from your book because I thought it was really interesting. It was talking about, I'll quote from your own book. Just as Will was writing, England was racked by a persistent concern about young women bucking the convention of marriage and living and working independently, or masterless, to use a term from that time. So in terms of what you were saying, like what these plays say kind of about society and what was going on. So he's writing more female characters, and in society, women are kind of doing a different thing. Can you speak about that connection?
Yeah, so women, there was kind of a rise in the 1580s and 1590s of women who were at the time known as masterless. So these are women who are living basically on their own, or certainly independent of a spouse or a father. And that was a huge source of anxiety for those in power in England at the time. This is also, probably not coincidentally, an era where you see a peak in witch hunting. There was a huge anxiety in England about witchcraft, and people who were most often targeted and executed as witches were women. And so you see all of this. Again, this is probably not separate from the anxiety about Elizabeth, this like queen who had been in charge for decades, but is soon going to die and doesn't have a clear heir. There's all of this gendered anxiety swirling through the air of England. And so it like makes a lot of sense that a popular piece of drama is going to put a lot of that on stage, where you have a female character who is violent, but also sympathetic, who is kind of ungovernable, but also ultimately brought down. And so you see the ambivalence that Shakespeare has toward Margaret, reflecting the way that his audience would have felt about all of these young women around them who are seen as like behaving in inexplicable ways, or misbehaving, or acting dangerously.
I'm just thinking again about all of these things are happening and the roles are being played by young men.
Yeah.
Is a whole other interesting level. I don't know if that makes it, because obviously, like at the time, like that was sort of, some people were scandalized or offended by men in drag, but also if that makes it a more palatable message to watch a woman, quote unquote, behaving in these masculine ways, but actually it's actually a man doing it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that it's still an incredibly sexist society, and it's an incredibly regulated society. These plays were one of the playhouses were one of the very few places that people could get together and talk about these issues. There were not, obviously there were not blogs, but there was not really news media in the same way. And anything printed was very heavily censored. So this was a place where people could, and the plays were censored as well. They had to pass scrutiny. But Shakespeare, obviously, he's literally Shakespeare, so he can slip things in, right? As are some of these other great Elizabethan dramatists. They can slip things in and they can kind of create conversation about this. And they know, too, it's not just the literary, it's the performance that people are seeing, too. It's the way people speak. It's the sounds, the voices, the textures, so the theater-going experience is also part of that conversation. And the fact that we have no women whose voices that we're hearing, we have not a single, this is a man writing and these are male people performing. There's obviously gender play going on there. And that's what a lot of people were, really uncomfortable with. But also, we're not really seeing, women up there on stage speaking. We will a generation or so after Shakespeare's death. We do start seeing professional actresses in Shakespeare. In England, but not at this time. It's still a very regulated performance style.
Well, and I just wanted, if we're going chronologically, like he writes part 2, part 3, then the prequel, part 1. And as he's writing these plays, Shakespeare is becoming more famous. Like he's yes. becoming known. Like at first you mentioned, and you say in your book too, the early plays, it was just kind of known, like these are collaborations, people working together. But eventually he starts working on his own. And then it's a new Shakespeare play. Like, can you talk about how that shift happened in his career where suddenly he became himself? That's the draw. It's like, it's a Christopher Nolan film. Like, I'll see it no matter what it's about because it's Christopher Nolan. It's like same thing like Shakespeare, right?
So like the era in which Shakespeare wrote the 3 Henry VI, or the first 2 parts certainly of the Henry VI plays, and possibly the third, are in what is referred to as his lost years. And it means that there are these 7 years where we know virtually nothing about what he was doing or even where he was living. And this reflected that Shakespeare was a young guy from a small town who was not yet a well-known quantity. And during the exact years that he's writing these plays, he's also writing other plays that become equivalently popular. One example is Romeo and Juliet. He's also writing poetry that was massively popular. And so by the early 1590s, he was probably principally thought of more as a poet than as a playwright. But what he's really doing is just getting a ton of words out on the page and on stage. And by the early to mid 1590s, he gets together the money, probably from a wealthy benefactor, to become part of a new theater company. And he gets more control over the works that are getting put on stage. And that helps him to sort of become cemented very quickly as the leading, or one of the leading practitioners of theater in the country. And it really helped, I think, that Elizabeth I seemed to like him, and that her successor, James I, really, really liked Shakespeare's work and the work of his company. And so his rising fortunes that's something that's happening as he's writing these plays, and can probably be seen in the fact that he gets so much license as these plays goes on to really play around with the history. So in Richard III, which is the 4th of the plays in which Margaret appears, he brings her back completely unhistorically. She's literally not in England at the time during the years that are depicted, but he brings her back. And I think that kind of freedom that he had to do that is reflective of the fact that he's becoming a more powerful figure and a more known quantity in the English theatrical world.
And he's experimenting with a lot of new things when he's writing Richard III. So Richard, if you think back to high school English class or something, if you've ever read or seen this play, he's the main character, but he is such an anti-hero. He's this horrible person, but he's so smart. And he's so charismatic. It's why actors love to play Richard, because he is, he's constantly punning, and he's coming up with all of these wild, conceits. And then Margaret is this character that Shakespeare brings back kind of unhistorically to spar with him. She, her husband has been deposed from the throne. She is sent to exile back in France, where she ends her life. But Shakespeare brings her back to be this kind of Cassandra prophet figure who is going to say, this is your Richard, your sins will catch up with you. Your family's sins will catch up with you. And she's right. Character of Margaret is right. Of Richard's family, the Yorks, they do lose power, and the Tudors do take over, and they become the ruling class. And so Shakespeare is kind of using her as a figure there to kind of go back and forth with him and to provide kind of some philosophical commentary on the way that history unfolds, and the way that that's kind of set the stage for, well, the metaphorical stage for where we've landed in the early modern era and in the Tudor era, how we got monarchs like Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, and then Elizabeth herself.
I have to say, Margaret's appearance in Richard III is personally my favorite because she's just like, she's unfiltered. She's just like, no fucks to give. She's just kind of like, everything has happened to her.
She has nothing left to lose when she comes in. She's like a ghost, kind of.
You mentioned in your book, The Hollow Crown, which is kind of this like TV version of the history plays. And I didn't know the Henry VI plays at all. So I was experiencing them for the first time. And then when Sophia Okonedo shows up in Richard III, I'm just like, what? Yeah. My fave is back. It was exciting. And I feel like an audience in Shakespeare time might have felt the same. Just like, oh my God, her? I remember her from the other plays.
It's that's actually a leading like scholarly theory on why Margaret's in the plays, because she's not necessarily in Richard III. She's not necessarily important to the plot, but she provides tremendous context and she's fun to watch. And she was probably a fan favorite that he brings back to fan favorite. Spar with this new character that he's created.
You know, like on an old sitcom when, I don't know, you know, like Steve Urkel walks in and the audience is like, whoa! Like, I feel like that's actually coming out. Yeah.
And that was my first introduction to Margaret was when I was in high school in English class. We read Richard III. And I even then I was like, who is this like character who just comes in and is just like, you know, like saying the most devastating insults to the King of England, like with seemingly no fear at all. Whereas every other character is really cowed by Richard. And he is predicting his death and downfall. And I think that is probably the way that audiences at the time would have reacted to her too. Not just like, oh my God, it's my favorite from these old plays, but also like, oh, like you go girl, like you tell it. Like, because you, the audience, are seeing things the other characters aren't. You're seeing like Richard is talking about like all of his evil plots and how he's gonna like have all of these people killed. And Margaret is the one who's like continuously calling him out and rallying the other female characters to oppose him. And so she's just delightful to watch.
And in the latter part of your book, you talk about various performances of these plays and how for quite a bit of time she was removed from Richard III. Yeah. She's often excluded from those, and it's kind of brought back. Like she's been sort of reinserted in some ways, but I forget if it was Helen Mirren or one of the other actors who said like there's no other character in Shakespeare who you can play from a young woman all the way through her life to an old woman. And the fact that she's in so many plays, are there any equivalent characters for men who have that same sort of ubiquity?
There are no other characters in Shakespeare of any gender who you see their entire life depicted on stage the way you see Margaret. Margaret first appears in Henry VI Part 1 as a very young woman, basically a young teenager who's newly wedded to the King of England. And she last appears in the chronology of her life in Richard III as a very old woman, like very near death. And there is no other character who you get the entire sweep of their life like that. So in that respect, she really is singular.
Yeah, there are a couple other characters in these history plays, like Richard III himself. He shows up as a young man, and then you kind of see him age across the plays. So sometimes theaters will do this thing they'll take all of these history plays and perform them in like a marathon, you know. So, or the Hollow Crown that you mentioned on television, where they'll have that's a series from a few years ago. They had Benedict Cumberbatch as Richard III. Tom Hiddleston was in it. And so the way they did it was they had, one actor play those characters all the way through, make it like a series, essentially. And whether or not Shakespeare actually saw these as a series, scholars debate. But so there are a few that you see like that, but none that you really see with the way that you do with Margaret. And I don't want to take anything away from the other wonderful characters that Shakespeare wrote in, non-serial plays, people like I, mentioned Cleopatra or Lady Macbeth or Othello, these wonderful characters, but you see them in portions of their lives. You don't see them really age over the course of many, many decades. And you see, one thing Shakespeare's also talking about is like the toll of war on people over many years. We see decades and decades of civil war, war within England and war between England and other territories. And he uses characters like Margaret and there are some other mourning widow characters that show up in Richard III, other queens whose husbands have been killed in the wars. And he's, trying to figure out, what effect does this have on the population when countries have been at war for so long? And Margaret is, I think, one of the strongest voices of that.
I think that's a good thing to keep in mind when looking at Shakespeare's plays. Is just like the audience, and it's illiterate people or people who have very hard lives who are going there. And it's just like, let's just have a nice time. Let's get our mind off of things. But one of the things we're getting their mind off of is the fact that the country is still getting, like, their parents, their grandparents, like, would have experienced war and famine and like plague. Well, I mean, how many times in your book did they say the theaters are shut down because of the plague? Yes. And like Shakespeare has to pivot. Like, the people are living these rough lives. So being able to sort of see a play where they feel themselves maybe represented in this grieving, in this mourning, of people who've also been through stuff like that. That's interesting, even though it's like, what are the events? Like, Margaret's life was 100 or 150 years before the plays, something like that.
Yeah, it's like 1430s to about the 1480s. And Shakespeare's writing almost exactly a century later in the 1580s and 1590s.
Yeah, and to them, that wouldn't be that long ago, really.
Yeah, it would be like if you're watching a miniseries or something about World War One. Maybe your great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, depending on your age, would remember it. But, also these are a lot of stories that have been passed down. They recognize some of the names, but not all of them. And another really fabulous thing, and why so many people are interested in Elizabethan theater, is because these playhouses were a place where you can really see social classes come together. And you can see people exploring things, kind of moving. You can really understand in looking at this era in theater history how theater would interact with society, how people would respond to it. People would make a day of it. They would go to the bear baitings as well. You can see like where it was, and we have a lot of evidence as to where it was in the city of London, where these theaters are. So you can, they were really, really a part of people's lives. And that's something kind of new in like Shakespeare's day. The theater hadn't been around for 100 years. These type of, narrative dramas, they were like only a couple decades old. So they were like really a place that people came together to experience stories together, whether they be, historical stories or stories that Shakespeare or any of the other playwrights at the time had adapted from, classic myth or something like that.
You talk about this in the book as well. I'm just like, everyone read the book. But like, if you could also just explain, just sort of like to wrap things up a bit, these like Richard III is one of Shakespeare's best known plays. Like, people studying in school, it's performed all the time. Henry VI, I didn't know, and I'm like a medium Shakespeare fan. Like, I just had never heard of it until it was included in part of the Hollow Crown. Like, why did those plays, why aren't they as popular, do you think, other than Richard III?
So I think that there are a number of reasons, and part of this is just speculation. But the Richard III is a true masterpiece. The Henry VI, and Richard III also, this is a point you made earlier, was written by Shakespeare alone. The Henry VI plays were the product of collaboration. Possibly because of that, they're somewhat uneven. There are these like amazing scenes, often many of them Margaret scenes, but there are also like a lot. There's like so much complexity. Like this duke is taking on this cardinal, and it's like some of it is kind of dull. And so you have this amazing character persisting through these plays, but the plays themselves are very uneven. And the other thing that some scholars have thought about is like the Richard III play has a very clear male protagonist. The Henry VI plays do not have a clear male protagonist. They have a really weak king, and then they have this like really powerful female character, which for like, directors or starring actors who wanted a vehicle for themselves, it's not necessarily like, who are you going to play? Are you going to play the antagonist who gets stabbed to death? Or are you going to play the like really weak king? Or are you going to play any of the other like assorted dukes? You probably can't play Margaret, who's definitely the most interesting figure. And so the Henry VI plays in that respect are just not attractive to a lot of like theatrical managers or leading actors in the 18th and the 19th centuries, and even in the early 20th century. And it takes really like, a number of things, but in part the sexual revolution to really get more interest in the leading female characters of Shakespeare, and in particular in Margaret. So you start seeing famous actresses like Peggy Ashcroft and Helen Mirren, and later Sophia Canedo playing Margaret only in the late 20th century. Once we've had the second wave of feminism and the women's liberation movement, and much more interest in female characters. than, there would have been in, say, the 18th to the 19th centuries, when it really was about like, which king am I, leading male actor going to play?
It's funny that it's called Henry VI when he's not the main character.
Yeah.
Well, and that wasn't necessarily the title that it would have had in Shakespeare's time. Those are titles that were applied when, like, after Shakespeare's death, when his collaborators are creating the first folio. And so that's where you get these titles, Henry VI Part 1, Henry VI Part 2. That's not even the way that Shakespeare necessarily even thought of them, but it just kind of becomes this convenient shorthand for like, oh yeah, this is the play about this king, this is the play about the next king. It becomes easy to track them historically. But yeah, Henry VI is like an interesting character, but he's not heroic. He's not like, someone who, he's like thoughtful, but he's not decisive. He's no Richard III.
And something that we track toward the end of the book is, in recent decades, there's been a lot more interest in paying attention to female characters from drama. And so there have been a number of productions that are about Margaret, where an actress and a director want to take on the character. So they will cut and paste, and they'll take all the Margaret scenes and they'll make their own drama, and they'll give it a new name. Sometimes it's called Queen Margaret or the Margaret or something. And they'll create a play that's just about her by cutting and pasting 3 scenes from, 4 different plays together. And they'll, use a couple scenes that she's not in to fill it out and make it a whole narrative. It's actually not a new tradition. People have been chopping and cutting and pasting Shakespeare's plays since right after his death. People are always cutting characters or, putting in musical interludes or something. Adaptation is part of the game. I mean, all of Shakespeare's plays were adaptations. He didn't have any original ideas. He was adapting all these other stories. And so that's something that's really kind of exciting about Margaret in recent years, is people are saying, all right, and when I'm in drama class, in drama school, the boys are going to go off and play Hamlet, Richard III, and maybe the girls would want to, play Margaret. She's one of these great roles, it's like, and so there's been an effort to reclaim her really in recent years, which has been really cool and exciting. And some of these plays have, really gone on. Some of them, were experiments that, we were not as successful, but, we're really seeing her kind of, especially in the 21st century, when there, people are kind of comparing her to different, figures in real world, in real life politics, because she is a leader, and so people are comparing her to like, Margaret Thatcher or something, pre-21st century, and she's kind of taking on a new life that way.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking because, when the plays came out, Elizabeth is the queen, and everyone's used to this kind of powerful figure. And then when the plays start being sort of reassessed, it's like you've got Margaret Thatcher, and then you've got like Hillary Clinton. So it's like you need to have women in power for people to accept a play about women in power. I don't know, something like that. I'm just percolating a thought.
Yeah, and as we know from Elizabeth's reign, as we know from, Thatcher and Clinton as well, like just because a woman is temporarily, in the seat of power doesn't mean that we've gotten rid of every sexist trope in society, right? It's still really present. And Elizabeth leaves, she dies in the early 1600s, and England becomes, it continues to be a very, very sexist society where women have, much harder lives than the men in those communities.
So at the time that this episode comes out, your book it's in the world. People are able to buy it. Do you have readings and events and things that people can keep up with you? Do you have a website, or what do you recommend?
Yes, we will be touring with the book. We're going to be talking at a bunch of bookstores and theaters about the book. A couple of those events will have actresses reading some of Margaret's lines.
Nice.
So you can see those events on our personal websites. Mine is scottwstern.com. Charlie, yours
Mine is CWBO Malley at .com. So CWBOMalley.com. We're going to be in June of 2026. We're going to be in Alameda, California, and Los Angeles, California. And then in August of 2026, we're really going on tour. We're going to be in Washington, D.C., New York, Pittsburgh, and Boston.
Wow. No, that's wonderful. I'm glad that they'll be... Yeah. I love the idea of having women reading the Margaret's lines. I think that would be not just talking about Margaret, but so people can have experience what it's like.
Yeah, you really can't fully appreciate Margaret unless you hear the speeches. Because I think she lives a really interesting life, and you can describe her and I hope make her compelling, but then you hear these really intense speeches that she gives, and it's just hair raising. I mean, it's amazing. I'm glad that folks will be able to experience that firsthand.
And if people are curious, a lot of this lives on YouTube too. So you can find even some old performances old, for as far back as YouTube goes, from the 1970s, 1960s, where you can see all sorts of different actors playing this role. And so, it's just hear those words embodied. Shakespeare wrote for people to speak. He didn't necessarily write for people to read his words. He didn't know that his plays were necessarily going to be published or people were going to read them. So when you hear them, it just really takes on a different meaning. You can really feel it in your body. That's the theater person in me coming through.
No, that's what I have found as well. Studying Shakespeare in school, it's one thing, but then when I was a teenager, I volunteered for the Shakespeare in the Park festival, and seeing those plays done, you're like, oh, this is fun. This is it's so much better than just reading it. So
yeah. And people think it's just the comedies that are fun, but these history plays, they have so much. They have drama, they have comedy, they have pathos. There's so much action and excitement in these plays as well. Because Shakespeare, he had to pay the rent too. He wanted his plays to be successful, so he'd get more commissions.
Exactly. And if you want people to go see your play instead of go to watch the public execution,
then you got to have a disembodied head. You got to have someone carrying on a head.
We have a disembodied head too. Come to the play. Thank you guys both so much for talking with me today. Your book it was so fascinating. I really enjoyed reading it, and best of luck with your tour and everything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're thrilled to talk to you today.
So I super recommend this book, Shakespeare's Margaret, The Dramatic Life of a Warrior Queen. It's really, really, really interesting, especially if you're like me. If you had a theater kid phase, just getting and reading all about what it was like to perform during Shakespeare's time, and then how the play developed and how the character developed through the years. So interesting. It's a combination of theater history and British history and Tudor history. So good. So interesting. Everybody should read it for sure. And I wanted to mention also, speaking of Shakespeare, we were talking about various Shakespearean plays in this episode. My favorite Shakespeare play is one that's also not much discussed. It's not Henry VI. It is, in fact, Titus Andronicus, which is Shakespeare's one of his messiest plays. It was written during the era when he was kind of co-writing with other playwrights. It's such a messy story. I love it so much. And I recorded a bonus episode of this podcast with my friends Lanoa Johnson and Allison Epstein. It's going to be available next week on our Patreon. And if you want to listen to that, now's the time to join my Patreon. So anyone who joins my Patreon, it's like a place where you pay a little monthly amount of money, and you get bonus stuff for that. So if you pay $1 a month, you get ad-free episodes of this podcast, Vulgar History. And if you pay $6 or more a month, you also get bonus episodes like the upcoming Titus Andronicus discussion, as well as we have movie discussions. Various different bonus episodes are going on there. Sometimes I post videos there. And this month, the month of July, when we're just kicking off this Tudor series, you can get 30% off your Patreon membership by using code TUDOR. So 30% off an annual membership or 30% off your first month of a monthly membership. Either way, I really appreciate the support, and I hope that I'm providing lots of fun stuff for you to enjoy on that Patreon. One of the other things as well is at the $6 a month level, you also get access to our Discord, where we're just talking shit about Henry VIII and having a really good time. So anyway, if you want to join my Patreon, go to patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter for all the details. There's a link in the show notes as well. But just use code TUDOR to get that sweet 30% off discount to join my Patreon, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. And if you love my writing, which maybe you've read my writing, maybe you haven't, but if you're interested in what my writing is like, I have written a book. It takes place in the Regency era. It's called Rebel of the Regency, and it's a nonfiction biography of another queen from British history who has a bad reputation. It's about Caroline of Brunswick, and that book is available now to buy wherever you get your books. Get more info on that at rebeloftheregency.com. And next week, we're barely just starting the Tudor era, but when I was asking on Instagram, where I am at Vulgar History Pod, who do you hope we talk about on the podcast? And there was There's a lot of responses, and several of them were like, are you going to talk about Henry VIII and how he sucks? And next week, that's exactly what the topic is going to be. So stay tuned for that. And until next time, my friends, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, scripted, and hosted by Ann Foster. Editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. Vulgar History artwork by Karen Moynihan. Social media videos by Magdalena Denson. Transcripts of this podcast are available at vulgarhistory.com by Aveline Malik. You can get early ad-free episodes of Vulgar History by becoming a paid member of our Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. Vulgar History merch is available at vulgarhistory.com/store for Americans and vulgarhistory.redbubble.com for everyone else. Follow us on social media at Vulgar History Pod. Get in touch with me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com.
Legendary stories, awe-inspiring sound, and endless adventure. Welcome to the realms of peril and glory. Explore the mechanically magical vistas of Vale, the paranormal mysteries of liminal London, and the cyberpunk chaos of Cyborg. Fall in love with our core cast, or be awed by our incredible guests from familiar shows like Oxventure, Three Black Halflings, and No Rolls Barred. Ignite your imagination and discover the realms of peril and glory today. Go to realmspod.com or search Realms of Peril and Glory wherever you listen to podcasts.
There are vampires out there. They walk among you, shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Heading to work, heading home, going to the bar. It's a life just like anyone else's, and I have grown used to it. To the darkness, to the moon, to the taste of blood on my tongue. But vampires are dying out. We are a fading kind, and I am the first one created in so long, and that is a dangerous thing to be. Those who came before me, elders of all stripes, they do not want to see our kind gone, and they will do anything to keep their power. And for myself, and for Grace, who created me, that is a sword that hangs above our heads. And the worst person of all carries our secret, and he will use it however he sees fit. Who do you look to when things are at their darkest? From the creators of Parkdale Haunt comes Woodbine, a podcast about monsters, dreams, and changes, those you want and those you never saw coming. Season 2 arrives September 24th, distributed by Realm.
Hi, I'm Whitney.
And I'm Katie.
And we're the hosts of True Crime Campfire. We set out to make a true crime podcast we'd want to listen to. We get right to the story. We don't do a lot of extra talking, and when we do, it's usually to roast the short hairs off of some loser murderer or scammer. You'll laugh, but only at the people who deserve it.
Like, which serial killer would you most like to shove into a locker?
BTK and his awful poetry. Dude got caught because he didn't understand what a floppy disk was.
We look for the stranger-than-fiction stories, like the case of Patty James, a killer catfish before the internet was even a thing.
Or Howard Walmsley, a sentient wad of damp laundry who convinced his town he'd won the lottery, fleeced local businesses out of thousands, and then became a romance scammer.
We've covered tons of cases you've never heard of. Cults, scammers, killers.
So come find your next great binge. Listen to True Crime Campfire on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes every Friday.